Oh, misfire.
Hey everybody, welcome to CoCon, and today we're going to be talking about basic land navigation. So what is basic land navigation? Basic land navigation is essentially using simple tools in order to find yourself around when you're outdoors. This can apply to some other stuff other than just being in the woods and whatnot. We can use basic land navigation when we're inside of urban areas as well. You guys probably do this all the time when you're using road maps or Google Maps. So basically you guys already used some of the concepts that we're going to show you here today, but today we're going to be mostly oriented towards doing this in the woods, but we'll cover some ways in the end about how we can use this for urban areas. Okay, so some of the required equipment that we're going to need to do land navigation effectively is we're going to first need a map of the area that you can physically be in. So it's not just any map. Yes, you can practice on any map, but the best way to do this is to have a map where you can physically be in. So if you can find maybe some national forests around you and get a map for that would be great. It has to be in 1 to 50,000 scale or one of the scales that you're going to have on your protractor. Next, you're going to need your compass. We suggest getting just a standard military style compass, the little green ones that flip open. The little forestry ones that typically have the little clear plastic on the outside of it with the compass ring on the inside. Those are a little bit more complicated. So I know Sunto makes those, and a lot of people like getting the Sunto gears, but try to stick to the military one. They're just more simple, and they're more geared towards land navigation. Then you're going to need a notebook and a pencil. It's pretty self-explanatory. You need to be able to write stuff down, and you need to be able to write stuff down that you can erase. Next, we're going to need some ultra-fine permanent markers. That's going to come into place later on when we use our laminated maps, because you can use those ultra-fine permanent markers to plot points on your maps, but you don't have to worry about them rubbing off. And then when you want to take them off, you can just use a little bit of alcohol or just scrub them extra hard. Okay, we're going to start getting into our meat and potatoes here. This is going to be some of the core content. And the first thing that we're going to cover is map colors. So first is going to be your black. That's your man-made structures. That does not include your roads necessarily. Next is going to be your red. That's going to be your major roads, built-up areas, and special features on older maps or military maps. So if you by chance get your hand on an old military map, you might see that like a UXO area or unexploded ordnance or some type of firing range. Those might be highlighted in red, and sometimes they'll have red striping on them or something to indicate other features, but red is going to be your major roads, built-up areas, and special features. Next is going to be your brown. That's going to be your contour lines and elevation lines. This is what we're going to have to dictate elevation shifts over distance. We'll get more into that later. Next, we have blue, which is going to be obvious. That's your water. And then we're going to have green, which is our vegetation. Okay, on this slide, we're going to do a little practice here. So feel free to pause it when you guys need to. But for this exercise, we're going to locate each type of colored feature on the map. So black being man-made structures, red being roads or other additional features. Brown is going to be our contour lines and elevation lines. Blue is going to be our waterways, and green is going to be our vegetation. So just pause it right here and find some of those things. All right, so I'm going to show you guys what we're covering here. So I'll give you guys our little answers. So we're looking for black, right? So black is going to be our man-made structures. So we can see all along here, we have our man-made structures. This is obviously a larger structure right here, but it's all square. You can pretty much tell it's man-made. All right, next is going to be our red. So if we're looking right here, we can see our red. There's probably something in the legend later on that'll explain what the red and white striping is, but we can see that that's a major roadway that runs all through here along this little river. And we can see our brown with our terrain features are all along here. You know, you can see all your contours. Then we're going to have our blue, which is our waterways. You can see long skinny ones are going to be our rivers, and circular shapes, or more organically circular shapes, are going to be our lakes. And then green is going to be our vegetation. So we know in this entire area on these hillsides, it's vegetated. And then we can see right here where there's white that it's not as densely vegetated, which is typically denotes that there's just not forest. So maybe there's some grass or scrub here, but it's not, you know, treed forest. Something to denote is if you ever see any areas where you can see hard lines in vegetation, like this area right here on this corner of Lower Village, you can kind of make the assumption that that's been purposefully cleared. So maybe that there's some type of parking lot or something there, but there's a hard line cut vegetation on this spot. Okay, map anatomy. So there's a couple parts of the map that you're going to need to know. We're just going to kind of boil it down here to the simple stuff. There's more stuff you're going to need to know later on as you get more advanced into land navigation, but this is land navigation 101. We're not even covering grid coordinates here. We're just going to be covering how to, you know, essentially navigate around. This isn't necessarily grid coordination. So our first thing that you're going to need to know is the title located at the top of the map, and that's going to designate the area that the map covers. That's important because if you were to pass that map off to somebody, it might not mean anything. But if you say, hey, this is, you know, this area, then they're going to understand. It sounds stupid, but if someone handed you a map without a title, you'd probably be pretty lost. Next is going to be your key and legend. So that's going to be located often near the bottom of the map. So that's going to contain your significant features of the map. So that's going to cover, like we were talking about in the last slide, with the roadways and other certain features that aren't obvious or well known that are maybe specific to that map. Next is going to be our scale. So scale is often found at the bottom of the map, and that's going to note the proportional size of the map. So whatever the scale is that's denoted at the bottom of the map is what we're going to use with our protractor. If you look at a military protractor, you're going to see little open little triangles, and that scale will match those triangle shapes, and that will help you determine distance and later on do grid coordinates. And that scale is located right on top of the bar scale. So the bar scale is located at the bottom of the map, and it's a bar of black and white repeating lines, and we use that to determine distance. So if you look on that bar scale, you'll see that it'll be notched to be certain distances. Sometimes it's 100 meters, sometimes it's a kilometer. It depends on the scale. So next is our declination diagram, and that's often located at the bottom of the map. This is going to look like two little lines that form a little V. And this diagram displays the difference between grid north, magnetic north, and true north. And we'll cover those later. Just note for now that the declination diagram is where you find the differences between that grid, magnetic, and true. And lastly is going to be the grid. And the grid covers the entire map in net-like pattern. And later on, when we do our more advanced land navigation, this is where we're going to be actually using our grid, like determining grid coordinates for specific locations. But for now, we're not worrying about that, but we will cover that later. Okay, so for now, what I want you guys to do is do a little practice, and we're going to locate some of the basic parts of the map. So we're going to locate our title, our key and legend, our scale, bar scale, declination diagram, and grid. I know that this is a little bit small of a map, but when I point this out, it'll make sense to you, and once you see that on this live map, you won't worry about it again. So pause the video here and do this practice. Okay, now that you guys have done your practice, let's cover the title. So our title is going to be right up here. So this is the Fort Campbell Military Installation Map. So obviously we know that this whole area is going to be Fort Campbell. Next is going to be our key and legend. Key and legend down low. This is going to be explaining what certain things are. So you can kind of see right here in this area that red and white striping that we talked about a couple slides ago as being a road. So on this map, if we were to find that, which obviously it's a little small here to do, we would know that whatever that says is what would have corresponded on the map. Next, we have our scale. Our scale is located right around here. So this scale is probably 1 to 50 thousandths, excuse me. And that's going to denote that this map is 1 to 50 thousandths scale, and that will correlate with the 1 to 50 thousandths mark on your protractor. Okay, and directly under your scale right here is going to be your bar scales. And those were those black and white lines that we use to determine distance. Typically, they have them in kilometers, miles, and nautical miles. You know, different branches of the military in different areas, they need it for certain things. But for most places, it's either going to be in standard miles or kilometers. And next, we're going to have our declination diagram. And that's this guy right here. This one's pretty tight. So the difference between your true north and your magnetic north is going to be relatively small. It's just going to be, a couple degrees of whatever that is there. This is also going to have the information that we're going to need later when converting and using the declination diagram. Next is the grid. I mean, you can see it all along here. That's where the grid is. It's pretty standard. Okay, so before we can move any further and get into our terrain features, we have to cover contour lines, because contour lines are very important to being able to display what terrain features are. So contour lines are what we covered in the last couple sections under the colors as being brown. So what contour lines are organically shaped lines and rings that determine elevation on a map. And typically down at the bottom of the map, you'll find a section that says contour interval. So what that contour interval does is notes the shift in elevation between the contour lines. So let's say, for example, the contour interval is 10 meters. Let me get my laser pointer out here. So if we know, for example, this hilltop is at 100, you can see that this color correlates right up here with this color. So the yellow area is the yellow area here. We're just saying 10 meters. In the real world, obviously, that's a lot bigger space. But the space between this line right here, which would be at 100, going down to this line is 10 meters. So this would now be at an elevation of 90, and this would be at an elevation of 80, and this would be at 70 on the outside. So we know as we progressively push away from this center point with this space right here, it's getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and vice versa. It's getting larger and larger and larger. Typically at a hilltop, you'll find an elevation that will be the high point. It's not always clearly 100. It might be, let's say, 103, which lets you know that the very tippy point of this hilltop is going to be 103. So we can make the assumption that downhill, this would be the next interval at 100, because the scale operates in 10 meters. So 100, 90, 80, and 70. Next, we're going to be covering our major terrain features. Why do we need to have standardized vocabulary for major terrain features? The reason that we do this is so that we can talk to other teammates or other entities that we're working with and ensure that we are able to have a shared language, so that if we need to point at something and say it's on the other side of X, they know what we're talking about. Because across all groups that do land navigation, sometimes there are people that might use other terms for other things. And we'll cover that on the next slide, because that's going to be the most prevalent case of that. But for the sake of covering what the major terrain features are, we have our hill, our valley, our ridge, our saddle, and our depression. And the mnemonic we use to remember these is, just like the picture shows right here, is hidden, valley, ranch, salad, dressing. Hill, valley, ridge, saddle, depression. It shares a lot of the words already, so just use that mnemonic, and those are what we're going to use when we talk to other entities and our teammates. Okay, so this is our hill. So a hill is an area of high ground, and from a hilltop, the ground slopes down in all directions. The map shows a hill by contour lines forming concentric circles. So the easiest way to look at this is it's a booby. It's a booby. Look at the nipple, look at the areola, and then you can see that, like we covered with the contour features before, they continue to slope down. Another term for a hill that other people use is mountain in some cases. A hill can be something as small as like a standard hill that you would roll down as a kid, and it can be as large as, Mount St. Helen. For the sake of having that shared vocabulary with other entities, any raised area that's just one pinpoint of high ground, we call it a hill. The only time that we maybe go back on that is if something is already known as being a hill, or excuse me, something's already known as being a mountain, like if it's denoted on a map. So if we were doing search and rescue operations, let's say at Mount St. Helen, we would refer to the mountain as the mountain. The reason why hill is sometimes confused with the term mountain, and why we use the term hill preferably and no matter what typically, is because if you go somewhere like the Smoky Mountains, this, like the hill that's this picture right here, that would be a mountain, like a big stinking mountain as far as the Smoky Mountains are concerned. You come out to the Rocky Mountains, and that is not that big. I mean, there are 14ers and much larger stuff. So for just for the sake of like keeping a similar vocabulary, this is a hill. Our next terrain feature is the valley. So a valley is a stretched out groove in the land, usually formed by streams or rivers. Valley has high ground on three sides and usually has a course of water running through it. So I'm going to spare you guys from reading the rest of that. You guys can pause the video and read that if you'd like. But for the most part, we know what a valley is from seeing movies and stuff. But keep in mind that a valley doesn't have to be some huge, expansive thing that they show in the movies. Sometimes a valley is just, the low ground between, two areas of higher elevation. The most important thing to note through this is that pretty much in most valleys, they have water in the bottom of them. The reason that they have water in the bottom of them is because over millions of years, or whatever you believe in, there has been erosion, and that erosion, as the water runs, takes those particulate matter away and cuts through whatever area it's in. So the valley at the base of it will almost always have water. And the contour lines, when you're looking inside the valley, are going to be U-shaped or V-shaped. And that's going to help you determine which way that water that's in the bottom is flowing. So the high ground is always going to be at the tip of your U or V shape. So the U or V always points upstream. So if we look right here on this map, we can see there's kind of these V shapes that are these contour lines. Especially right here, it's pretty obvious, but you can see there's V shapes. So we know that upstream, since it points to upstream, is this way. But we don't care about upstream. The water's flowing downstream. So we can make the assumption that the water, in this case, is running from our left to our right, because the V's point upstream. Next is our ridge. So a ridge is a sloping line of high ground. If you're standing on the center line of a ridge, you'll normally have low ground in three directions. Unless you're at the high point of a ridge. I'm not going to read all that again. But the way to look at a ridge is it's basically a string of hills. So if we look here, we have our boobies. 1, 2, 3. So we know that there's 3 areas of high ground, 3 hills, and that, as we see up here, is going to be our ridge. It's pretty obvious. This says that they form U-shaped or V-shaped lines. The closed end of the contour points away from the high ground. That's usually true on the end, so you can see like right here, there's that U, but there's a lot of cases where a ridge line is bigger than your map, so you might not actually get that. Okay, so next we have our saddle. Our saddle is basically a dip or a low point between 2 areas of high ground. It's not necessarily the lower ground between 2 hilltops. It can be the space between ridge lines. So if you look at a ridge line, in this case, you can see right here, there's a hill right here, and we can make the assumption that it's a ridge line because you can kind of see that there's some other circle there, some other contour line indicating there's multiple there. So this would show that this is a ridge line, and this is the low area between them, as noted here, It looks like a horse saddle. It's pretty obvious there. They say hourglass. I mean, I guess it looks far more like a regular horse saddle. Next, we have our depression. So this is one of the more rare ones. You're not often going to find this out in the wild, but you could. And if you see it on the map, it's important to note. So a depression is a low point in the ground, often known as a sinkhole. It's always surrounded by higher sides in all directions. So imagine the inverse of a hill. Instead of your hill, it's dipped into the ground. It's your depression. So whenever we have sharp contour lines or sharp shifts in elevation with contour lines, we note that by showing these little cilia or these little lines right here. And that shows that there's a sharp shift in elevation. And whatever direction they point to is obviously wherever that elevation shift is going. So in this case, they're pointing down into the depression. So we know, as you can see right here, there's almost like a cliff. This is probably a sinkhole or something other that happened there. But yeah, so this is basically the inverse of a hill. It's just a hole in the ground. Usually on a map, you'll see a depression, but it might not be so steep as having these little cilia. It might just be close contour lines. Those contour lines might be really, really close together. So if each of these were to be 10 and 10 and down below, we would know that there's a really steep drop right here. So yeah, just know that there's not always these little cilia marking a depression. It's just a hole in the ground. Okay, so now we're going to talk about our minor terrain features now that we've covered our majors. So there's only 3 of them, which is easy, but they're the draw, the spur, and the cliff. And the picture of this fist is going to come into play later. We'll talk about it in a minute once we get to each of them. Our first minor feature is the draw. So the draw is a less developed stream course than a valley, so we remember that water flows down a valley. But in the case of a draw, it's just a weaker version of that. Sometimes you'll find water in a draw. More than likely, if you find anything at all, it'll be a very small little stream. But those same rules about the U-shaped and V-shaped contour lines pointing upstream are the same thing here. So we see these small V's right here on your draw. They point upwards. So that means we know the water flows the opposite way, which is downstream. Just like we see here. Water flows from high ground to low ground with gravity. The way that you're going to know you're in a draw is that if you're standing inside of it, the ground slopes upwards in 3 directions and downward in the other direction. So basically a draw is just like a micro valley on the side of a hill, if that's a easier way for you to remember that. And if you look right here again, going back to that previous picture of a fist, if you could imagine that these were fingers, right? This was a finger and this was a finger. The space in between your 2 fingers on your fist, the crack between your fingers on your fist, we can call that a draw. That would be what a draw looks like. And that'll be in contrast to what we cover next, which is the spur. Our second minor feature is the spur. So the spur is always in conjunction with the draw, where the draw has those V shapes and U-shaped contour lines pointing to higher elevation. The spur has those V and U shapes pointing to lower elevation. So where the draw is the low ground, the spur is the high ground. So if we remember back to that first picture we showed in the previous slide talking about our minor terrain features, and it had a picture of a fist. If you're looking at your fist, your spurs are going to be each of your fingers, and your draws are going to be the spaces in between your fingers, the cracks between your fingers. So the easiest way to remember that is just by looking at your fist. Fingers are your draws, or excuse me, your spurs, and your cracks are your draws. Okay, our last minor feature is the cliff. So a cliff is a vertical or near vertical land feature. It's an abrupt change in the land's elevation When the slope is so steep that the contour lines converge into one carrying contour of contours, this last contour line has tick marks pointing towards the low ground. This is misleading, and this is what I was talking about earlier when I was saying that the contour lines can be misleading. Not always will a cliff have the lines directly on top of each other, where there's such a vertically sheer face that it's like straight down. A lot of times a cliff will be at a more gradual angle, but there's no way you could climb it, and it's obviously a cliff by all intents, purposes, and descriptions. These little cilia, I've never seen that once in my entire life on a map. Maybe they're out there somewhere, but other than training purposes, these little guys are never on there. You're going to know that it's a cliff because these are almost on top of each other or on top of each other. Okay, the last of our terrain features are our supplemental terrain features. They're supplemental, I would presume, because they are man-made. These are not naturally occurring features. They only occur in areas that's occupied by humans. Okay, so this description is very long-winded. The basic understanding of a cut and fill is that man either cut the ground out or man filled the area up with something. So if we look here, train tracks and roads are usually the most common cuts and fills. So if we look right here, we can still see that the ground has been filled up over here to keep this train track relatively at a level, even elevation. And then as it goes through the mountains, they've cut it out. They've blown it out. You see this a lot in Appalachia or the Rockies, where, you know, they've cut the hillside out. And that's how we know that it's a cut or fill. And just like how on the depression or the cliff, they note that there's these little cilia pointing towards the low ground. In this case, the low ground's away, and the fill, and in the cut, it's the low ground is centered. Although this is less common, you'll typically see this marked out of something with the legend or the key, which will show like a railroad track or a road. But yeah, the things to know is that it's a man-made feature that is either filled in or cut out by man. Okay, so on this slide, we're going to do a little bit of practice. So what I want you guys to do is identify your major, minor, and supplemental terrain features. I have them listed here underneath where I just read. So take your time, pause the video, and find each of these on this map. Okay, answer time. So if you haven't paused it and do your thing. If not, we're going to get to answering it. So first is our hill. That's going to be our obvious. We're going to look for our boobies. You see a hill right here, right? That's a big, obvious hill. It's mostly isolated. Next, we're going to have our valley. So our valley is going to be the area that would be on the low side of a hill. Most likely that this would be occurring right here. On this low area, you can see all this high ground dumps down to this low area. And then you can see this section of steep terrain shift right here. So we can make the assumption that this is low ground that goes through here. Something else to know is that you can see this is a road, most likely, or a train track or something. It's a man-made feature because we have our fill right here. That man-made structures typically go through low areas because it's just flatter and more consistent. So we know that this area over here is probably a valley. Next, we have our ridge. So our ridge is going to be our connecting and concentric hilltops. So we see our hill, and they all share this contour line right here that goes all the way around. So we know they're connected. So these concentric hills form a ridge that goes around here. Next, we're going to have our saddle. So our saddle is going to be the spaces that's in between the hills. So hill here and hill here. We can see this is low ground. The terrain goes down based on the contour lines, and then it begins to rise back up towards this hilltop, denoting that we have a saddle. Next, we're going to have our depression. So in this specific instance, they did denote that the depression has those little cilia, and they point towards the low ground, the little legs. So we know that this is our depression. That would probably be a sinkhole. You can see there's a sharp drop and then another sharp drop inside. So this would be almost like funnel shaped if you were to look at that. It wouldn't just be like a big hole in the ground. It would be funnel shaped. Okay, next we're going to have our minor terrain feature is going to be our draw. So we know our draw is accompanied by our spur and typically has water running through it. So you can see these little guys. These lines are most likely water. Obviously, this is a black map, but it would most likely be water, and you can see that it's probably an intermittent creek because the line is broken up with dots, which shows that this creek is probably here intermittently throughout the year, so it's part-time. But it's a draw, and as you can see, it almost looks like it's drawing up, like someone grabbed it and drew it up there. So it's like it's pinched up, and our V shapes point upstream, so we know that our water flows downstream. It comes out the opening of the U. Okay, next we're going to have our spur, which is always in accompaniment with the draw, and that's going to be right over here. This is going to be here. So if you look at this, it would almost, you can imagine this is a fist. So if you take your left hand, make a fist, and stare it right in the face, like we could say right here would be your pointer finger. This would be the gap between your pointer and your middle finger. This would be your middle finger. This would be the gap between your middle finger and your ring. And, you know, we don't quite have a pinky necessarily over here, but you get the point. So if you were going to look at your fist, that's the best way to remember draws and spurs. You have your draws go up and spurs go down. Water is inside of the draw. Next, we're going to have our cliff. So this is a good example of what I was talking about when we just covered cliffs. If you look over here, you're going to see that those lines are almost on top of each other, but technically aren't directly on top of each other. So if you stick in the Army TMs and the military stuff, they're, by definition, this would not quite be a cliff, but if you were to go step on this, you would fall straight down on your face and die. Like, that is very, very, very steep. You can see if each of those were, say, were 5 meters, that's 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. Like, that's very steep. And next is going to be our supplementary features, our cut and fill. So we can see right here, the cilia, the little lines point outwards. So that's most likely our fill because it points towards the low ground, which means that this is high ground. And we have our cut. So like I was saying, once again, with the contour lines and the cilia being a little bit not always as accurate as you need them to be, this or deceiving, this would be your cut right here. So you can see that there's sharp elevation lines that are showing that there is a feature that cuts right through the end of this little hill or ridge line. But it doesn't have the little cilia to denote that that's a cut. But we can tell that if this is high ground and this is high ground on this hill, then this is probably a cut. Okay, going on to the next slide here. We're going to get into our meat and potatoes and start getting into working with our compass. Okay, now we're going to be getting into our technical side of land navigation that we've covered, what the basics of what a map is and what the things on a map are. So we're going to be covering under the azimuth section what an azimuth is. We're going to be covering what a magnetic azimuth is, what a grid azimuth is, what a back azimuth is, and a magnetic declination, which is going to be necessary for going back and forth between your magnetic and grid azimuths. Okay, so to start, azimuth is just a direction measured in degrees clockwise from north on an azimuth circle. So this sounds really, really complicated, but it's not really. It's just standard angles. Like if you were doing math in middle school or whatever, you probably would have covered this. So you can imagine if this is, the ground right here, and this is your celestial sphere. This is what you see all around you when you look up the dome above you based on your perspective. Your azimuth is simply your direction on the surface of the ground in degrees. It's just a direction that bases off of north. So over here, it would be like if it had shifted X amount of degrees and the thing you're looking at is over here, then this degree that we would denote typically in the center of here would be what that azimuth is. And that sounds complicated. It's really not incredibly complicated. Once you do it, you'll understand it. So we give this in either degrees, which is we have 360 degrees in a circle. 0 and 360 are overlapping, so we never give 360 degrees. We either do 0 all the way through 359 degrees, or we use millradians. So millradians, also known as mils, basically break down the circle instead of 360 degrees into 6,400 mils. So same thing applies as the degrees would, in which we don't use the overlapping 0 and 6,400, just 0 through 6,399. So there are 17.78 mils in 1 degree. So this makes mils slower to use because you have to be, it's hard to read, but it's far more precise. So if you've ever seen a long-range shooter say, oh, you know, they're dialing on their mils for their left and right or whatever, millradians are just a measurement of difference in degrees. So yeah, mils are just a more precise version of degrees. For the sake of what we're doing here today, because this is a 101 class, we're just going to use degrees because it's simple and your compass is probably easier to read. Just know that it's less accurate. If you're going long distances, I would highly suggest learning millradians or mils, because that will give you a much more precise azimuth or direction. Next is our magnetic azimuth. This is going to be our first of our types of azimuth. So the magnetic azimuth is an azimuth taken directly from the compass in degrees or mils. For today's sake, like I said, we're going to be using degrees. So compasses operate on magnetism, so we know that based on the way that a compass works, if you read a direction or an azimuth off of that compass, it's magnetically based, thus your magnetic azimuth. So for the sake of this compass in particular, we would see that this is our 0 degrees, typically points north, but our compass is magnetically bound, and this will always point to your actual north. Just because the way that your poles work. So as you rotate your compass around, this stays true to north, and that will give you your degree shift. So we know that as you've turned your compass, and this is continuing to point to north, then you are currently holding at about 110 degrees. So your magnetic azimuth, based on what this compass says, would be 110 degrees. Next is going to be our grid azimuth. So this is going to be an azimuth that we take directly from a map in degrees or mils. So the way that this works is, let's say this is a known point. We know where this is at, and we're trying to find a direction to another point on the map. We'll mark this point, and we can draw a line from the known point to the new point in a very straight line. You can either use the edge of a fresh sheet of paper, or sometimes people will take the guts out of a piece of 550 cord, tie a little knot right here, and have that string going out to the edge, and then you can kind of pull your string around here and figure out where your direction is. So we'll place the dead center on a known point, draw a line straight out, edge of a piece of paper or otherwise, to a marked point, and then we'll be able to read our azimuth here. So this inner circle is going to be in our degrees, and this outer circle will be in our mils. You can see 6,200 right here, 6,300, 0. So if we were to look at this, we could, do 50 or 0, and then we would work all our way around, and right on this long line would be 50. So we know we're one notch back. So it's about 49 degrees. So your grid azimuth, or the azimuth that you pulled off of a protractor in a map, is going to be, in this case, 49 degrees. Okay, so this is going to be one of our most important things when determining where we are at on a map when we eventually get into triangulating your own position. So this is the back azimuth, and the back azimuth is simply the inverse of whatever azimuth you've pulled, whether that's magnetic or grid. It's just the inverse. So an example, if you're on your azimuth that you pulled is 90 degrees, the exact inverse of that is going to be 270 degrees. And there's an easy way to remember this, and that is if your azimuth is less than 180 degrees, you're going to add 180 degrees to that number, and that will give you your back azimuth. And if your azimuth is 180 degrees or more, you're going to subtract. So the little easy picture device that I've given here is minus equals plus. Less than 180 equals add 180. And opposite here, if you're over 180, that equals minus 180. Pretty simple thing to remember here, and this is going to be huge coming up here shortly. This is our magnetic declination, and this is a little bit complicated, but if you remember back in the very beginning of this, I showed you a picture of like all the parts on a map, and one of them was that declination diagram, and that declination diagram just it denotes the difference between the true north and your magnetic north. So in the case of this, your grid north or your true north is going to be exactly what it would be on a map. But keep in mind, maps are flat and the real world is round. And also, your magnetic north does not point directly to the North Pole. The reason that it doesn't do that is because there are magnetic deviations and just like general variances across the world. So there's lots of iron deposits inside of the Rocky Mountains. So your magnetic north would be slightly off from your true map or grid north. So the magnetic declination, is the difference in degrees between the magnetic north and the grid north, and often displayed at the bottom of the map. So when converting from your grid azimuth to your magnetic azimuth, if the declination is west, you're going to add to the true azimuth. If the declination is east, you're going to subtract from the true azimuth. And when you're converting from your magnetic azimuth, if the declination is west, subtract it from the magnetic azimuth. And if it's east, you're going to add it. This sounds super complicated. Honestly, you're probably not going to have to remember this entire area right here. When you get a map and you have your declination diagram, this little thing will typically have a little block of text that will say, if converting from grid to magnetic, do this. And if converting from magnetic to grid, do this. It'll give you the little math problem that you have to do. But in the case that you don't have that little diagram in there, you're just going to have to memorize this. It sucks, but it's just you're going to have to memorize it. Or if you're going into an area and you're going to be moving around, just already have this memorized, or not necessarily this, but have your declination memorized. So, it sounds difficult. It's not necessarily that difficult because most maps will have it noted. So now we're really getting into how to actually do land navigation. So what do you do with your compass, map, protractor, pens, pencils, and notebook? What do you do with all that stuff? So for this particular thing that we're doing, we're going to be determining a compass direction from a map. So if you remember, the compass direction is your magnetic azimuth, and your map direction is your grid azimuth. So to put this into the terms we've previously said, we're taking a grid azimuth and we're going to convert it to a magnetic azimuth so that we can take whatever direction that we determine we want to go onto a map, and we can put that into our hands with our compass, and we can begin to navigate to a point. So the first thing you have to do is orient your map by aligning north and on the map with north on the compass. So what the purpose of this is, you get it all laid out in front of you, and then you're able to look up at your surroundings around you and everything is oriented to north. Next, you're going to use your protractor to determine your grid azimuth. So we're going to take that protractor and we're going to put it on a known point of most likely where we're at or our starting point. And we're going to have that protractor perfectly aligned to the grid on the map. It has to be perfectly square to the grids, or else none of this works because your azimuth will be inappropriate. So once you have your protractor perfectly square to the grids, we're then going to use a sheet of paper, or like we talked about earlier, the inside piece of a 550 cord tied to the center of your protractor. And we're going to draw the line directly from the known point in the very center of the protractor to wherever you want to go, wherever that point is that we're trying to pull the direction from. And once we get that piece of paper aligned under the protractor perfectly, we'll be able to look at the edge of the protractor and see where that direction lines up. And we can actually get whatever degree that says we're at is going to be our grid azimuth. So then we can use the magnetic declination diagram, which was the arrows, if you remember, in the bottom of the map, and we can do the conversion typically like we covered before. It says what it is, and we can take that declination adjustment and apply it to the grid azimuth and do that subtraction or adding, and it'll give us our magnetic azimuth. Next, we can pull up that compass and put it right in front of our face, and you can either hold the compass directly up to your eye and look down over it, or you can hold that compass to your chest and look down upon it. And then you're going to take that converted grid to magnetic azimuth, and then take that azimuth and turn yourself and orient yourself to that direction. And now you can begin to walk towards that direction. And that is how we get our compass direction from a map. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do here is determine a compass direction from a map. The way that we determine a compass direction from a map is by converting a grid azimuth to a magnetic azimuth. So we can take an azimuth from here, put it into our hands with the compass, and then we can navigate to where we're trying to go. So for the sake of today, we're going to be using the Mount Margaret Trailhead. You can see this map, Mount Margaret Trailhead, and this is the whole system right there. So we'll place a point at the beginning of the trailhead. And let's say we want to navigate to peak 8522, which is right here. So what we'll do is we'll put a very precise mark right there. And the first thing we'll do is take our protractor or anything with a straight edge. We'll draw a line between them. The line needs to be decently long, and you need to be as precise as possible. My my permanent marker here is struggling a little bit, but we'll get a nice good line. If you can see that line right here, that goes from the trailhead to peak 8522. And then what we'll do is we'll place our protractor. I'll scoot this up so you guys can see it, directly onto our starting point. We'll make sure this protractor is as square with the grid pattern on this map as possible. It has to be square because you're getting an angular direction. So if it's not square, it won't work. So we'll line up the edges of everything, get it nice and perfect. And then we can see, and this inside scale right here is our degrees. So if I pull that direction, that would be about 25, 26, 27 degrees. Is our grid azimuth. So now we need to convert that from a grid azimuth using our declination diagram to our magnetic azimuth. So if we did that, that would be 27 plus 8, or excuse me, we're going from grid to magnetic. So we're doing a subtraction of 8, which would put us at 19 degrees. So now that we have our converted azimuth, we'll take our compass. I'll just get this lined up for the sake of me. And we will then, I know it's a little hard for you guys to see, we'll go to 17 degrees. So if I were to do that, it would look something like this, approximately. And then we would be able to know that this direction that we have this compass pointed in is where we would be able to look up and see where the where that peak 8522 would be, and we could begin navigating to it. The inverse of this is determining a map direction from a compass. So now we're going to take our magnetic azimuth and convert that to a grid azimuth. So we're going to do the same thing that we did before of orienting the map to north with the compass so that you can have your bearings properly. And then we're going to use that compass to determine a magnetic azimuth. So for example, if there was a mountain off in the distance and you wanted to go to the peak of that mountain, but you wanted to see what was in between you and that mountain on the map, you would shoot a magnetic azimuth from your compass by looking down your compass as it's directly pointed at that mountaintop, and you're going to read whatever that magnetic azimuth is. Then you're going to use the magnetic declination diagram down at the bottom to convert the magnetic azimuth to a grid azimuth. So it's just the exact opposite of what we did in the last slide. So now you're going instead from grid to magnetic, from magnetic to grid. Then you're going to place that protractor down on your location directly over top of you. And you're going to perfectly align your protractor with the grid on the map. And then you're going to take a piece of paper or that gutted piece of 550 cord, and you're going to draw, you're going to align that with whatever your converted magnetic to grid azimuth was. And then you can draw a straight line. Typically the way I do that is I'll go out all the way to the edge of my protractor and I'll mark a little dot, and then I'll just use the protractor as a bearing to draw your line back to that point. And then you can see that is your bird's eye view, your straight shot to whatever that point is. Okay, so what we're going to do now is determine a map direction from a compass. So essentially we're converting our magnetic azimuth from the compass to our grid azimuth, which is the map. So if we were at the trailhead, the way that this would work is that you would be standing on the trailhead and you would take your compass and you would shoot it to a point of interest that you wanted to plot on the map from your known point of which you're most likely standing on. And then you would convert that using your declination diagram from magnetic to grid, and then you would go from your known point and plot that. And that's going to look something like this. So let's say we're standing at the trailhead and we are looking and we see a lake around us. So what we would do is we would take our compass and we would shoot an azimuth to that lake. And let's say for the sake of this example that the magnetic azimuth we shot was 275 degrees. So in order to be able to plot that on the map, what we need to do is convert 275 from magnetic to grid, which we know is plus in the case of this map. And that would mean 275 plus 8 degrees is going to be 283 degrees grid. So what we're going to do is place our protractor down here, and we're going to put that directly on our trailhead, which is right here, our known point. And we're going to find 283 degrees. So what we can do is we can take a flat edge of paper, and we'll line that up and find our 283 degrees. And 283 degrees would put us right about here. So we'll do a little marking on the edge of this paper. Whoops, excuse me. And then we can draw a hard line from our known point to where we did there. And we would know that if we were looking at our compass at 200 and let me see what I have here, 275 degrees, then we would be looking, if this were a map, right through here. So we can see on this map that we're probably looking at the little, there's a small little island right there, and that shoots right through Parvin. So if you had done that, you would have been able to look at any lake, not sure what it is. You could plot it on the map and then see that it runs right through Parvin. So the lake you were looking at was Parvin Lake. So let's say, based off of your last slide, you've determined the direction and drawn a line from where you were at to that last mountaintop. So what we would do in this case would be to try to determine what the distance is between those 2 points, because we have to know how far we're going to travel if we're going to walk along that route. So what we would do is we would take a piece of scrap paper with a flat edge. The flatter the better, the straighter edge. So like a piece of copy paper would be excellent for this. And what you would do is you would place the edge of that sheet of paper on maybe the corner of it to give you a nice starting point on you or your known point, and then you would align that piece of paper with the point you just marked. So in this case, it would be that notional mountaintop we were just talking about. And then what you're going to do is along the edge of that piece of paper where that mountaintop is, you're going to make a tick mark. So that gives you your straight line measurement, like converted onto that flat edge piece of paper. Then what you can do is you can take that reference measurement and you can take that down to that bar scale at the bottom of the map. So what you're going to do there is place it along that bar scale and make sure you're not including the fine scale refinement on typically the left side of the map. There's some finer scale refinement. You're going to ignore that for now. Just focus on the larger sections of the black and white line, and you're going to measure your fine line or your line on the edge of that piece of paper on that scale. And then once you get to the last largest reference point, you'll mark that. And if there's any overhang, you can take that down to your fine scale refinement, and that's where you can get your more refined final. But let's say, for example, that distance was longer than what your scale is, longer than the bar scale on the bottom of the map. So what you would do is you would mark out that full length of the bar scale, mark it off, write the number down. Like, let's say that's 6,000 6,000 meters. So it would be 6 kilometers. You'd mark it off at the 6, and you would bring it back down to the beginning of that bar scale, and you would continue to measure that out as far as it can go. And then once you have hit the end of your coarse scale, you would mark it again and bring it over to your refinement scale, and that's where you would get your final your final and refined distance. You would add that all together, and that would be your distance between 2 points on a map. Our next activity is going to be determining the distance between 2 points on a map. So we can build off of the last example that we did. So if we were starting at this point and we determined this was a point of interest that we wanted to go to, Parvin Lake, and we marked our points here, or marked our line, what we can now do is place a mark at the edge of Parvin Lake, because we're presumably not going to go into the middle of Parvin Lake, to the edge of Parvin Lake, and we could determine this distance so we know how far we're going to travel. So the way that works is by using the scale down at the bottom. So as you can see, the scale is broken down into 1 kilometer sections, which says right here this total is 6 kilometers. So we know that each of these sections is 1 kilometer. Excuse me, you can't see that. Each of these sections is 1 kilometer, with the first section being broken down into 10 different sections, which, if you did the math, is 100 meter sections. So to determine the distance from our known point right here to where we're going at the edge of Parvin Lake, we would take a straight edge piece of paper and we would place the corner of that on our starting point, and then we would make a little mark right here to our point of interest, or where our termination point, where we're trying to go. And what we'll do is use this area in between to determine how far it is. So we can take that down here to our scale, our bar scale, and we will line this up on the very edge. So we can see that this area, or this length that we're trying to determine, this being one edge and this being the other, is somewhere between 1 and 2 kilometers. So what we would do is we would go to the end and we would come back slightly to the 1 kilometer mark. We would put a little 1 there. So we know that it's 1 kilometer to this distance, and then there's some spare left over here. Then what we would do is take this area down, the remaining area, to the edge of the bar scale again. And we would see that it's 1, 2, 3, 400, pretty much on the dot, extra meters over top of what we just did. So we knew that if we had 1 kilometer before, and we added 400 meters, that would be 1.4 km, or 1,400 meters. And a secondary part of this that we can learn is what to do if your distance that you're trying to measure is larger than your scale graph. Essentially what you'll do is you'll use the scale, mark it, and then you'll continue down and bring your measurement down again and begin to measure again. So let's say on an example here, the distance that we're trying to cover is this long on the map. From what we've discovered, we can ignore these previous points. Those are nothings from me doing something else. So let's say this distance is how far we wanted to go. It was almost the whole length of this paper. So what we would do is bring it down here to our bar scale. We would line that up. We would mark 6. This is 6. And we would bring it down again. And we would remeasure once again. So we were going down to here. So this would be 6, 7, 8. So we know that that's 8. And there's a little bit of a tag in that hangs over there, which, we'll just ignore for the sake of this, but you get the point. You basically will fill this all the way up, mark it at 6, bring it back down, and continue to do that until you get to the distance you need. This is the last thing that we're going to cover today on this lesson for Land Navigation 101, but this is 100% the most important thing that you can do with basic land navigation. This is how you get your location through triangulation. So determining your location through terrain association. So you should be able, by the end of this, to be able to look at the terrain in front of you, and through triangulation and finding it on the map, you will be able to find your own location. And this is the most important thing you can do. So the first thing that you're going to do is find 2 significant terrain features that you can see on your map and visually on the landscape. So if you have 2 big mountains in front of you, or back to what we said in the very, very beginning of this, if you're in an urban area, you can take maybe cell towers or large buildings or something like that. And you can visually see those buildings or those mountaintops, or cell towers work amazing because cell towers are typically marked down on modern maps, and they're dead obvious and they're accurate because they're relatively small landmarks. And then you're going to shoot a magnetic azimuth to both of those points. So you'll be able to find those points and shoot a magnetic azimuth to them on your compass. Then what you're going to do is you're going to find the back azimuth. So if it's above 180 degrees, we're going to subtract 180 degrees from that number. And if it is greater than 180 degrees, if it's above, you will subtract 180s, and if it's below, you will add 180, which is just the inverse of your magnetic azimuth. If you've shot that azimuth, you can also just use your protractor to find that inverse as well. If you have a long enough piece of paper, you can just line it up. Next, you're going to convert those back azimuths from magnetic, which was your compass, to your grid azimuths, which is what's going to be on your map. Then what you do is you plot those converted back azimuths on your map, centered directly over what you believe are the proper landmarks that you saw on your map. And then where those lines intersect is going to be your approximate position. The more accurate you are with this, the more accurate your exact position is. Doing stuff like this is where, in the beginning, we were talking about mills. This is where mills really come into play and can be extremely helpful. But for the sake of degrees, this will do fine. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do here is determine our location through terrain association. So what does that mean? That means that if you're looking at the world around you and you're lost, this will teach you how to find two major terrain features or two significant terrain features and be able to triangulate your own position. So the first thing that we're going to do here is, let's say we're on the Mount Margaret Trail somewhere, and we know that we're at an intersection of a trail, but we're not sure exactly which intersection that we're currently at. So the first thing that we're going to do is find those two major terrain features that we are going to want to use for associating to or triangulating to. So let's say we're standing at that intersection of the trail and we see two lakes. We see a smaller lake that's kind of on the left side of our view, and then there's another lake that's on the right side of our view, but it's a little bit bigger. And we are currently standing on an intersection. So the first thing we're going to do after we find those two major terrain features is we will take our compass and we will shoot an azimuth, a magnetic azimuth, to each of those lakes. So let's say, for the sake of this, you shoot your magnetic azimuth and you determine that the lake on the left is at 231 degrees, and the lake that you see on the right is at 280 degrees. So here we get into our practical side of it. The first thing that we're going to do is use our declination diagram right here in the corner, and we're going to do our math to convert these from magnetic azimuths, which 231 degrees, M for magnetic, and 280 degrees, M for magnetic. We're going to do from magnetic to grid. That's an add, and we see that it's 8 degrees. So we're going to add 8 degrees to both, and that is going to give us, I've done the math above, don't cheat, our 239 degrees grid, and then we're going to have our 288 degrees grid. So the next step after we do this is we're going to need to determine the back azimuth, because if you shoot an azimuth to something, let's say for the sake we see lake here, whatever, this isn't the lake, but you shoot an azimuth to it, and now you want to continue that azimuth, it'll only go past it because it's directional. So now what you would need to do is determine your back azimuth, or the thing back to you. So if we're going to determine our back azimuth, we can remember the rule that if it's above 180, we're going to subtract 180 degrees. And if it's, and the same thing here, if it's above 180, we subtract. So we currently have our grid azimuth, so we're going to do minus 180 degrees, and that will give us 59 degrees, and this will be our back azimuth. The same thing here, minus 180 degrees, and that will give us our back azimuth of 108 degrees. So what we can then do is place our map, and we can plot the back azimuths from the suspected terrain features. So we saw that there was two lakes that we were looking at, a smaller one on the left and a larger one on the right. So we can kind of, if we're in this general area, make the assumption that Parvin Lake is probably the smaller one on the left, and Dowdy's probably the larger one on the right, and we're in this general area. So Well, let's begin to plot our back azimuths. So the first thing that we're going to do is go off the left leg, which we're making the assumption is possibly Parvin. Parvin. And that right leg is possibly Dowdy. Dowdy, question mark. And we need to have a back azimuth of 59 degrees. So we're going to plot that point right in the middle of the terrain feature that we associated to. So we'll do our back azimuth of 59. So we'll place this very precisely right here in the middle. Get this nice and squared. And we'll use a nice flat edge to find our 59 degrees, which we think is about right here. We'll mark it right there. And we will continue the line right there. And we'll draw it. And then we'll do the same exact thing for Dowdy. So the back azimuth off of Dowdy was 108. So we'll put a plot right in the middle of the lake that we pulled to, line this up, and then we're going to pull our back azimuth of 108. So we'll put this here, line it up, and read the degrees of 108, which is right there. Make our little mark, and we can use a better straight edge to then line those two up to our dot. Draw a line, and we know where those lines intersect is our position. And if you see three trails come together here, so we know this is our current position. And that is how you do association through, how you determine your location through terrain association, also known as triangulating your position.